Hello, and welcome to Knoll Memorial Library's podcast, Research Bites,
where we introduce you to new topics and talk about the who's, the whys, the whats, the wheres, and the whens.
Hey, Celeste.
Hey, Martha.
So today we have with us Dr. Jonathan Gill to talk to us about Shakespeare, focusing on the genres of comedy and tragedy.
So, Jonathan, are you okay if I call you Jonathan?
Yes, please.
Thank you so much for being here. We're happy to have you. So Shakespeare is one of your main research topics. Dare I say you're a little bit of an expert in him. But do you want to give us just a brief overview of what you'll be talking about today?
Yes, I was thinking about genres and our perception of genre, comedy and tragedy. And I thought that for discussion, it'd be interesting to look at one of Shakespeare's tragedies that actually has quite a lot in common with his comedies, that being Romeo and Juliet, one of the most famous plays ever written. And I think there's a lot of interesting and unique elements to that play.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that great overview. Now we're going to do a deep dive.
Deep dive.
So Shakespeare writes Romeo and Juliet about 1595, 1596. This is really the height of his comedic period. Throughout the 1590s, he's writing a lot of romantic comedies.
Do you want to give us a brief overview of who exactly Shakespeare was for anybody who's not familiar?
That might be worth doing, yes. William Shakespeare, he's born during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I in a very small town called Stratford-upon-Avon. He's born in 1564. When he's 18, he gets married. We know he has 3 children, but for the next decade, the 1580s, we don't know much about his life. That's the period of time that's called Shakespeare's lost years, where we don't have any real documentation of what he's doing. We know he has 3 children, though. But by about 1590, we know he's moved from Stratford-upon-Avon to London. He's working there as an actor, and he's also writing plays. It doesn't take too long for him to be successful as a playwright, and his career gains more and more momentum. By the end of the 1590s, he's pretty well established as England's most significant poet. He writes for about another 10 years, the first decade of the 1600s, and by the time of his death, he's left behind at least 39 plays, one of which is lost, but we have the other 38. And his his literary output only becomes more famous and more celebrated as the centuries go on. I believe he was voted England's 5th most significant figure in all of English history.
Wow.
So, yes,
and it's all of English history, not even just like the literary.
Yes, right, with historians, politicians, inventors.
So when he died, did all of his plays that he wrote, did he get to see them put on at all? Or did he make so many of them that he just didn't get to it?
Nearly all of his plays were performed during his lifetime. There's 1 or 2 that seem like they were unperformed. He didn't seem particularly interested in getting his plays published, though. And fortunately, some of his friends and the actors who were performing his plays thought it worthwhile to actually publish them. So we've got 38 published plays. We know of 1 other lost play that he definitely wrote. We've got records of it, but we don't actually have the play anymore. That one's called Cardenio, about a side character in Don Quixote.
That sounds interesting, actually.
Yeah, there's intrigue about that, where a poet 100 years later puts out his own play and says he's found the lost manuscript of Shakespeare's play. And so there's a lot of controversy and textual studies on trying to ascertain, is there any Shakespearean qualities in the 1700s play?
That's the fun part, is trying to figure out, is this Shakespeare or is it just not?
Yeah, and a lot of our advancements in stylistic tests for looking at authorship did come out of Shakespearean studies and trying to ascertain what did Shakespeare write, what did others write, when did he write it. I suppose with that overview, I was saying that he's writing mostly comedies in the 1590s. The year 1600, more or less, give or take a margin of 1 year, is when his career shifts more into tragedies. He writes Hamlet. That seems to be a big turning point in his career. And then he starts writing tragedies at a very frequent rate. And even when he does comedies after that point, they're darker, they're more philosophic and brooding, so they're importing characteristics of the tragedies into the comedies he writes towards the end of his career. So he only has a few tragedies that he's written in the first half of his career, the 1590s. Romeo and Juliet, again, one of his most famous plays, I think only Hamlet has it beaten. That's one that shares something of a family resemblance with the major comedies that he's writing during that time. So I want to talk about what does that actually mean. The most basic explanation, and this was an explanation used during Shakespeare's lifetime of what makes a comedy and what makes a tragedy, is to say that a comedy ends in marriage, a tragedy ends in death. That's nice as a very quick rule of thumb, but it feels to me very unsatisfactory to hear. Because if that's our definition, then we don't know what we're watching until the very end. So there has to be some sort of mood or atmosphere or some underlying set of assumptions about what makes the genre of tragedy work, where we're perceiving this as a tragic, serious play, or we're perceiving this as a festive, upbeat, romantic comedy. And hopefully we'll get to talk about one or two scholars who've gone into exploring how can we define Shakespearean comedy, Shakespearean tragedy. The first major concept I want to bring in actually comes from a mid-20th century critic named Northrop Frye. He has a very famous book called Anatomy of Criticism, where he coins the phrase green worlds. You could say green worlds or enchanted worlds. The idea is that Shakespearean comedies usually take place in two worlds. There's the everyday world of business transactions, social status, people going about their day-to-day lives in some city setting. And then there's a green world or an enchanted world where the characters escape to or get shipwrecked on or something like that, which is more ethereal. Maybe there's fairies or there's magic, or it's just sort of this exotic place where there's more of a fairy tale logic to it. There's not a strict social or political hierarchy, but instead kind of this more whimsical, fantastical place.
Does it give him more flexibility to create the world because it is more fantastical, so it's not really linked to any real place?
Well, I think the most productive element of the green worlds for Shakespeare's dramatic art is trying to ascertain the parallels or the structures relating the green world to the everyday world.
And these would happen not simultaneously in a play. They would be either or they would happen.
So usually the green world is a distinct setting that the characters are in, but in terms of the subtext, I like what your question's asking, where the green world seems to be overlaid on top of the main world. And this enchanted, magical space is an area where the characters can discover elements about themselves that they didn't know, or elements that they didn't have the liberty to express in the more strict, serious city environment, and where there's much more of an emphasis on role play, on play acting. So the green worlds in Shakespearean comedy can be very self-referential, where an actor's not only playing the role, but he's playing an awareness of the act of playing in a theater.
Ah, interesting. So it wouldn't necessarily be like, for those of you who are familiar with Shakespeare's work, like Midsummer Night's Dreams, where it's like way out there, like fairies and everything. It could still be like fully like not totally a fictional world, but still contained within the real world. Does that make sense? Is my question? I feel like I'm asking a weird question.
Realism?
Right. Like it doesn't necessarily have to be magical realism.
Sure, it doesn't need to be actual fairies. In something like Merchant of Venice, it's just this city called Belmont, and it's kind of this island, and they're the main heroine, her father's dead, and he's left behind some will where any suitor that wants to marry the daughter has to go through this strange love test. So Belmont doesn't operate under anything that feels like a realistic logic. There's no magical elements to it. It's just a locale where you're getting princes from Morocco, and there's fabulous wealth, and there just seems to be, it's nighttime all the time. Characters are talking about starlight. There's perfume. There's all of these kind of exotic elements to it, whereas the main world in Merchant of Venice is very much about merchants and creating contracts, and so much more of a grounded approach.
Okay, I see. Very cool.
Yeah. I do like Midsummer Night's Dream, though, as perhaps the paragon of the green world or the enchanted world, where in that play, the main characters are two young men, two young women. Some of them are in love with one another, but the initial setup is that in the city, and here it's Athens, we're in ancient Athens, the father of one of the women wants her to marry a different man than she's in love with. And they end up escaping into the forest. There they meet all of these fairies. And in this fairy setting, you start to get interesting recollections of that city of Athens. There's still a king and queen with some very strong parallels to the Athenian king and queen that he's just taken captive and not getting into it. So, yeah, at a literal level, the forest is distinct from the city,
right?
But really we're exploring some sort of subconscious, subterranean realm beneath kind of the everyday surface of life, where things are more uninhibited, things are more mystical, and that enables the young lovers to explore their imaginations, their emotions, their inhibitions.
That makes sense. I love Midsummer Night's Dream. I feel like we could have a whole other podcast episode just talking about that. Sorry to get you a little off topic, but
just a side quest.
Yep.
So Romeo and Juliet's actually written right about at the same time as Midsummer Night's Dream. And it doesn't have a green world as a distinct location, but it does have a mask and a masquerade ball.
Okay.
In it, where the characters are in disguise, it's nighttime, and that mask is the time where Romeo meets Juliet initially. And in fact, the mask is necessary. Romeo and Juliet are from separate families. Shakespeare tells us at the start of the play that these two families bear an ancient grudge against one another. So they've been feuding with one another for centuries upon centuries. We never get a clear understanding of what the feud was about, why they hate each other.
Probably forgot by then.
It's just
we're just mad at them. We don't like them. Don't ask why.
It's just established now that if you're a Montague, you dislike Capulets, and if you're a Capulet, you dislike Montagues. So if you're at a masquerade ball and you're wearing masks, then that's one instance where a Montague could meet a Capulet without them realizing kind of the political or social ramifications.
Right, and that's exactly what happens, right? That's when Romeo meets Juliet.
Yes.
Is that in itself like that's a green world? Like it's a setting where they could act out something that wouldn't happen if they didn't have a mask on?
Yes, absolutely.
Like
It's a
green world.
contained space. It happens at nighttime, which I think is also significant. There's kind of a contrast between the sun, what happens in the day gives us these ordinary business transactions, whereas nighttime, it's a much more personal. So it's a much more uninhibited space. And that proceeds into the most famous scene of the play that's called the balcony scene. If you go through that scene, almost every speech is kind of this very quoted, famous bit. Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?
Yes.
And so that's continuing on in something like a green world mode of logic, where they're talking about the moon, they're creating these rich, lush metaphors for their love, and they're using metaphor as ways of trying to negotiate and discover their feelings for one another. So some of the poetic qualities of these very romantic scenes are standing in for romantic bonding, for building chemistry, and for discovering what sort of social boundaries are we comfortable casting aside, because we're in defiance of what our parents would want, even having this relationship. So that's one major comedic element that we have in the first half of Romeo and Juliet. There's some other features that are very reminiscent of Shakespearean comedy. There's a lot of wit and kind of these flirtatious pieces of dialogue. You've got some battle of the sexes scenes where men and women are kind of outwitting one another.
So funny.
So the audience knows this is a tragedy. Shakespeare said so in the prologue. The prologue tells us that these two lovers are going to die. So there's no ambiguity about how things are going to end. But I think watching it, a lot of times you get a semi-comedic experience out of it. The big turning point in the play is right in the middle. Romeo and Juliet have secretly been married. There's a character named Friar Lawrence who's gotten them eloped in secret, but nobody else knows this. So Juliet's cousin, Tybalt, who's been hounding Romeo, and he's been kind of menacingly holding his sword and saying sinister things in the background. He ends up slaying Romeo's best friend, Mercutio, and Romeo retaliates. The two are in a sword fight. Romeo kills Tybalt, and that causes the prince, effectively the mayor, to banish Romeo. That's all in the middle of the play, and that's where we move from a sort of romantic comedy play into what's much more clearly a tragic play. Now, there's still comedic moments in the second half of the play. There's one where the servant Peter is just kind of fooling around with some musicians. He's clowning around, I should say, probably played by the clown actor in Shakespeare's company. But those feel out of place or feel so trivial. You just have this kind of clown routine. Meanwhile, everyone thinks Juliet's dead. The friar's plan's falling apart. Romeo's a murderer and he's banished. So we don't even really have time for just some weird jokes about the musicians. And the cynical answer to that would just be to say, well, Shakespeare wrote a scene that wasn't very funny. I think the more interesting interpretation is that those moments where things feel trivial or out of place are part of the point, that they're almost a litmus test for us to see how much has has changed, how much this feels different versus the first half of the play, where we could have clowning around, we could have kind of the flirtatious rom-com interactions.
It's kind of cool, too, because I know you mentioned earlier where they defined comedy as ending in marriage. And the first half of the play ends with them getting married, like eloping.
Quite literally, yeah.
And then the second moves to the shifting where it's a tragedy and they end in the lovers die. So that's kind of cool where it does both.
Yes, it is in some ways half a comedy or an abridged comedy and then an abridged tragedy in the second half. Yes. There's one scholar that I had mentioned, Stephen Booth, who I think has a very interesting discussion of the genres of comedy and tragedy. This is in his book, King Lear, Macbeth in Definition and Tragedy. For Booth, the two genres, comedy and tragedy, both conjure an implicit expectation of order which the dramatic action deviates from. So he sees there's a lot of common ground in some of the circumstances of a comedy, of a tragedy. The example he gives is of a clown crossing the stage and slipping on a banana peel, kind of classic slapstick comedy. Not Shakespeare, but he applies it to Shakespeare in just a bit. Booth thinks the banana peel does is that it heightens the audience's awareness of the natural order of what a walkway does. If I'm moving from point A to point B, I expect that I have the infrastructure to do that. And the banana peel is the aberration, the deviation from that expectation. And that aberration is what elicits laughter from the audience. So in the case of a comedy, this deviation ultimately ends up reinforcing our expectations of a status quo and expectations of an order to the world, that the banana peel's an aberration of walkways getting us from point A to point B, but that aberration kind of reinforces our sense, well, there actually is a purpose, there's a meaning to what this piece of infrastructure does. Tragedy might have the same incidents, but there's no reinforcement of this is the way things are done, this is the order of things. Rather, it makes the audience terrified as it's pointing out some of the brittle parts of our expectations of the status quo. Places where things don't hold up so well, if you're examined. Blind spots where the way society's constructed might not fit everyone. And so tragedy can be much more threatening to the expectations of order that it conjures up. I think this has a lot of value with Romeo and Juliet because we see throughout the play, and particularly these all get kicked into high gear after Romeo kills Tybalt in that pivotal turning point. We see different systems about the society that Romeo and Juliet have grown up in falling apart and failing them, and that leads to the ultimate tragedy. Those three systems are political authority, spiritual authority, and then time itself, or time and fate, perhaps we could say. For the political authority, there's a prince. He's a minor character in the play, but after Romeo murders Tybalt, he has to have Romeo exiled. And makes good sense. You can't condone murder, but the audience knows more than the prince does, and we are fully sympathetic, largely sympathetic to Romeo and Juliet. So this banishment ends up creating all of these new obstacles for this marriage that had just happened. Now he's away. Juliet's family wants Juliet to marry another man.
Right,
Again, this very comedic element where the parents are an obstacle to the young woman's romantic desires. There's the choice of the of the young, dashing man, the Romeo, versus the elder, more socially established suitor. So all of the promise of reconciliation that the marriage of Romeo and Juliet, all of the potential healing that this could bring for society is undone when Romeo's banished, and that creates a series of complications in the plot in the second half of the play. Juliet goes to the friar who had married them, and he's able to construct a convoluted plan to get her out of the marriage to the man her father wants her to marry, and to secretly reunite Romeo and Juliet. And the importance, that whole plan is contingent on a very specific sequence of events where Juliet's father, named Lord Capulet, wants her to marry the suitor of his choice named Paris on Thursday. And when he sees her in grief, he doesn't understand quite why she's grieving. She obviously can't tell him that it's because Romeo's banished. And so he thinks, as poor as the logic might be, he thinks the marriage might help her get out of her grief and cheer her up again and distract her.
Because obviously marriage makes everyone happier.
Yes.
Especially to someone you don't want to marry. Like, you just need to get married to someone else.
Yeah, that will solve
help you
all
with
the
everything.
problems.
Yes.
Where the brittleness of this status quo comes into place is when Lord Capulet, the father, chooses to move the marriage up a day from Thursday to Wednesday. And that ruins all of the little pieces the friar's trying to put together of how Romeo and Juliet can get reunited. So the plan gets more and more chaotic as Juliet has to improvise and deviate, and Friar Lawrence can't inform Romeo of the changes to the plan in time.
That can be comedic if it's delivered in a comedic way, but that sounds also stressful.
Yes.
So tragedy.
Yes. Yeah. It's like the miscommunication trope gone wrong.
And that's the point Stephen Booth is making, is that a lot of these elements could fit into a comedic context or into a tragic context, but there's an underlying set of assumptions about the status quo, or the nature of things is a phrase Booth likes to use. And those set of assumptions change whether this feels like a comedic misadventure or if it feels like some serious looming catastrophe.
Yeah, well, and it's like, it's all going to end horribly because Shakespeare tells you at the beginning, so you're like, oh no,
But he
what's
could
going
be
to
just
happen?
kidding, because I would be like, that's just a joke. Like, he's just trying to throw me off.
I don't know. I don't know. Anyway, yeah.
But the back and forth kind of reminds me of whenever I'm watching something and something like really bad happens. I'm like, this is a really serious scene. This is a serious movie. But then something funny happens. I'm like, I don't know whether to laugh or cry. How do I feel? I don't know. Is this a comedy now? I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
Have you ever had the experience on, let's say, social media, or maybe there's a news report where you hear something that feels very ironic and it feels funny, even though the events related could be tragic if you take them seriously?
Yeah.
So there's that ambiguity of laughter and sadness happening together. Yeah.
Sorry to get you off track.
No. Those are largely the points I wanted to make. So as the friar's plan is going awry, then you're seeing how the political authorities represented by the prince are failing the young lovers. Their families are failing them. The friar that they've entrusted so much into ends up failing them. He's there in the final scene when Juliet's in the tomb. A lot of complications go on, but he has a moment at the very end of the play where he can save Juliet from killing herself. Romeo's dead, and the friar comes onto the scene at that point. he ends up fleeing in fear because he's ashamed of what's going on. He hears that the Capulets are coming in, and so he's ashamed. He flees at the moment when Juliet needs him, and that leaves Juliet alone, where she can take her life. So where both Romeo and Juliet end up dead through essentially a convoluted sequence of miscommunications going on. And so that's the major weakness of Friar Lawrence as a character, his inability to be there when Juliet needs him the most.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last one I had mentioned was time and fate. There's a lot of references to fate and the stars as emblematic of this cosmic necessity or this malicious fate that's out to get Romeo and Juliet. One of the most famous phrases that comes from the play is star-crossed lovers. You'll hear a lot of characters in fan fiction and in TV shows described as star-crossed, and that's coming from Romeo and Juliet's prologue. Star-crossed, meaning that the stars are crossing or betraying Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah.
And with that plan being so contingent on a Thursday wedding, moving that up from Thursday to Wednesday, kind of this arbitrary move the father makes, ends up throwing the whole thing awry. And so that very system of time starts to unravel and fall apart, and things start getting much more frantic as we can't have things meticulously calibrated and calculated in the way the friar was hoping to.
And the audience knows, like, why moving a marriage up one day is actually ruining
Is
their
devastating.
plans.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So you can see things going off the rails,
Yeah.
and then
Which
the
is
train
tragic.
keeps tipping further and further until everything collapses.
Yeah. So one last question before we wrap up. Why is genre so important? Like understanding the elements of genre. Why is it so important in literature for the readers?
That's a very good question, and I think there's a lot of possible answers to it. My own interest in the genre of tragedy and the genre of comedy comes from trying to get to those underlying perceptions and assumptions we have of, if this feels funny, why does it feel funny? Or if we think of tragedies as more serious, more profound, more high art, what is it about that genre of tragedy where we treat it as something dignified and artistic and potentially profound and revelatory? So at least for me, it's very much using genre to describe perception and to describe how does this piece of literature whip us with ways of diagnosing, interpreting, analyzing our own lives. That for Stephen Booth, comedy and tragedy are bringing about some explicit awareness of a status quo that's in place. And can that awareness of the status quo be productive, be creative and interpretive in one's own real life?
I lied. I have one more question. So you mentioned it a little bit, but how did Shakespeare's creation of these elements in the genre kind of trickle down into genres today with the media that we consume? How has that reflected in his own writings?
That could be a whole other podcast, too.
I know.
That's a huge question. I do think that...
Or why it's important. What's the important part about it?
Well, I do think our expectations of rom-com, romantic comedy, do actually come a lot from Shakespearean comedy and this kind of festive celebration between a witty, interesting young man and a witty, interesting young woman. That he really pioneers that battle of the sexes back and forth kind of witty dialogue. in his romantic comedies, and that sets in place kind of a lighthearted, almost whimsical set of expectations we have when we are watching rom-coms today. For tragedy, I think there's a very direct literary influence where poets and writers who are wanting to create serious, dignified, perhaps brooding characters are hearkening to Shakespeare and often explicitly quoting and citing Shakespeare to try to create tormented, profound, paranoid, or sometimes bloodthirsty characters. So there's a clear literary tradition you can follow if you're looking at the poets of the late 1600s, and especially the poets and playwrights of the 1800s, where Shakespeare's reputation gets to its highest point, and where Shakespeare becomes kind of the literary juggernaut that he has been ever since.
The development of tragedy is so fascinating. Like, a lot of my research is like ancient Greek tragedy and stuff, and like developing that into like the Roman tragedy, and then Shakespeare has like adapted his tragedies from that is like so into what we do today is so interesting.
He's just everywhere.
He is, yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, we just want to thank you one more time for being here. We really enjoyed talking to you.
My pleasure.
We will be linking the book that Jonathan mentioned by Stephen Booth into our podcast notes if anybody is interested in reading that. Jonathan, is there anything you'd like to plug?
No, you can find me at LSUS. I'm in our English department, and I'm always happy to chat about Shakespeare, about literature. But I don't have. But I'm not. I'm not here to give any.
No, you're good. All right. Well, thank you for listening, and that's a wrap.